Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And in a minute here when we start, I know it's been a while, so we'll be starting in Matthew 17. This is where we're going to be picking up here in a minute. So, and remember we just finished talking about, this is going to become important later. There's been this sort of turn in Jesus' ministry. Whereas remember, for a while now, he's been traveling around in Galilee, up in the northern part of the Holy Land, going from town to town and village to village and around the Sea of Galilee, and preaching to people and healing people. And now he started heading south, down towards Jerusalem. And in addition to heading south, down towards Jerusalem, he's also begun talking to his disciples more openly about what's going to happen once he gets there, once they arrive in Jerusalem, which of course isn't going to be good. And of course, last time we saw this question that has been sort of hanging in the background as far as who Jesus actually is. So he asked Peter directly. I remember St. Peter gave his response that he was the Christ, the Holy One of God. And Jesus responded that Peter was a rock, and on the rock he would build his church. We talked about how that was referring more to his confession than him as a person. We're going to see a little more about that as we go. And then immediately after, remember St. Peter gave this right answer and got this great praise, he turned around and told Jesus how he wasn't in fact going to die, how Peter wouldn't let that happen when they went to Jerusalem, and he got called Satan. So he kind of went from in very quick fashion. So that's sort of the context we're in. They're on their way south. They're on their way to Jerusalem. They've just had this moment with St. Peter. Okay, and that's where we pick up here. Unless anybody has any questions before we start. Left over. Okay. So chapter 17, verse 1. Now after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, led them up on a high mountain by themselves. Before we go further than that, we've seen before that when St. Matthew mentions things, he doesn't do it for no reason. Right? Remember we had the desert that was by the coast of the lake that had all the grass in it? He still described it as a desert because he was trying to make a point. Well, similarly here, he doesn't point out that it was after 6 days for no reason. Right? 6 days remind anybody of anything?
That's when it was creation.
Right. God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. And so, the Sabbath day day of rest was throughout the Old Testament, right? It was a symbol of what Israel was aiming at, right? Not just on a weekly basis, but everybody's waiting for the weekend. But in the sense that that this life being full of toil, work, struggle, but then in the end, hoping to find rest in God, that they would enter into God's rest. So, by setting this up this way, after 6 days, right? Matthew is telling us that what we're about to get is a picture of what? Is a picture of God's rest, right? Or a picture of the end, of the goal. So Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, and we talked about how Peter, James, and John, this is James and John, the sons of Zebedee, how these three form sort of the inner circle of the disciples with Jesus. Takes them up on the mountain by themselves, and in verse 2, he was transfigured before them. The word in Greek is literally metamorphosis. So he was transformed before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. We'll stop there. So first, Jesus is transformed. His face is shining like the sun, meaning what? You can't look right at it. and his clothes become as white as light. So his clothes also. Why his clothes? Did you ever think about that?
Because it come through, his body was white and come through it.
No, this says his clothes was transformed, not just...
He was transformed.
Yeah, he was transformed, but his clothes was also.
Transformed.
His clothes became...
The light coming, of Christ coming through to the clothes.
No, it says the clothes became white. It says the clothes became white. Right? Okay. Well, if this is a picture of God's rest or the Sabbath, right, or the end, right, the goal, right. So, in a way, what we're getting here, Jesus was just talking about his death, right. So in a way now we're getting a picture of what? The resurrection. The resurrection. Right?
Oh, I know.
And the resurrection isn't just of somebody's soul, right? When we're talking about the resurrection, we're not talking about, oh, well, he's off in a better place now. Or, oh, he lives on in our hearts, right? We're talking about the resurrection, we're talking about the person who is dead being alive again, right? And so the resurrection, this transformation, is not just of people or their souls or their consciousness but it's of this whole world, right? This whole world, the material world, right? The material world. So it's not just his body, it's his clothes that he has on, and his sandals, right? It's the whole world around him, right, in this picture. And it's important to remember that. That's an important detail, because it's important to remember that, right? This is not Jesus showing them, oh, here's what I looked like before I became a human, right? This is what I used to look like back when I was just God, right? That's not what it's saying. That's not what's going on, right? He's showing them a picture of what in the resurrection, right, humanity looks like. Where the glory of God, because humanity is united to God, the glory of God shines through humanity. It shines through the material world. Right? Because heaven and earth have come together. Right? And then secondly, we have Moses and Elijah show up. Now Elijah, remember, didn't die. Way back in the long ago time when we read 2 Kings, like 2.5 years ago. The fiery chariot came down from heaven, he rode up into heaven, so he still had his body. Now Moses, a little different case, because remember, the end of Deuteronomy, it doesn't say anything about what happened to Moses other than nobody knew where he was buried. Right? Moses died on the mountain, and it says no one knows where he's buried, no one knows where his body went, even up to this day. So Jewish tradition, right, outside the scriptures, had been, and there are a number of works, there's one called The Ascension of Moses that you can read, was that after he died, Moses' body was taken up into heaven. It was taken up into heaven. Now it doesn't say that in Deuteronomy, it doesn't say that in the Old Testament, but it seems to imply it here, right? Because it doesn't say Moses' ghost showed up along with Elijah. It says Moses and Elijah showed up. Right? It says Moses and Elijah showed up. And when we get eventually to 1 Peter, right, we're going to see something similar, where 1 Peter is actually going to refer to the ascension of Moses and talk about when the Archangel Michael battled with Satan over Moses' body, because Archangel Michael was going to take it to heaven, right? The devil wanted to decay it like every other dead body. Okay. Why do I make it a point to bring all this up? Okay. Well, a lot of our Protestant brothers and sisters, one of their primary doctrinal propositions is sola scriptura, right? Just what's in the scriptures. Scriptures alone, just what's in the Bible. If it's not in the Bible, not true, not reliable, not not valid. Okay? Well, the New Testament authors, St. Matthew apparently did not believe in sola scriptura. Right? And St. Peter in 1 Peter apparently did not believe in sola scriptura. Because he quotes these things that aren't in the Bible. And nobody thinks they're in the Bible. There was no one arguing for the ascension of Moses to be part of the Bible at any point. Right? These things are outside the Bible, that are part of the tradition, right? That the New Testament just views as valid. We'll see more of these things before we're done. But this is one example right off the bat. Right off the bat. That we can't and shouldn't try to restrict what God is doing in the world to just what's here. We can be sure about what's here, but God's active everywhere all the time, right? Doing things that we don't know about and don't need to know about necessarily. Okay. So Moses and Elijah appear. Now there are other people who could have shown up, right? Like Enoch, for example, right? Remember, he was taken up into heaven. He didn't die, right? And in fact, in a lot of the Jewish literature from this time, where they have two people show up from heaven, it's usually actually Enoch and Elijah. Right? In most of the stories, this one we have Moses and Elijah. So why these two? Well, Moses wrote what? Right? The law, the Torah. Right? He wrote the Torah. So he wrote the law, and Elijah was a what? Right. So when people talked at this time about what we now call the Old Testament, right, about the Hebrew Scriptures, they referred to it in these two divisions, the law and the prophets. Right? First 5 books, the Torah, the Pentateuch, the law. Then you had the former prophets and the latter prophets, right? So these two coming here bearing testimony to Jesus represent the Hebrew Scriptures, the whole, what we call the Old Testament, bearing witness to Christ. And not just Christ in general, right? They don't just show up and give their testimony like a commercial. You know, hi, I'm Moses, and I want to let you know this guy's the Messiah, right? But they show up and they witness to what? Christ resurrected, right? To the resurrection. Right? So this is telling us something about how we ought to read what was at the time the Scriptures. That what the Scriptures are talking about, ultimately, what they're ultimately about, is what? Christ and his resurrection. Christ and the victory he's going to win. Okay. So, Peter, James, and John, astonished, as you would expect. One of the things I like best about the Transfiguration icon is that one of them, I think it's James, has his sandal sort of flying off. Because they're all, losing a shoe. Right. And so our friend St. Peter jumps in, as he's wont to, as we've seen, right? He's always ready to make a proposal. Verse 4, then Peter answered and said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. We'll build 3 little tents. All right, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah, and we'll all just hang out here. This will be great. If you were a little more modern and capitalist, you would have thought to charge admission. Right? People can come, come see Moses, come see Elijah. Right? Come see Jesus. Now, is he wrong? No, he's not wrong. This is where we want to be, right? This is right. This is where we want to be.
So that's why they're saying.
And that's why it is good.
Yeah,
right?
but I mean, that's why they're wanting to build the.
Right.
Because they don't want to leave.
Yeah.
They just want to.
We'll just settle right here. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Right. But what would that mean? What would that mean if they just settled here?
Heck with the rest of the world.
Well, that, yeah. And they're trying to get here without what? What was in between them and the resurrection?
Death.
Right, the cross, death,
Cross.
resurrection. Right. Let's just jump right to here. This is the good part. Let's not go through all that other stuff. Right? Let's just stay here. This is good. Right. So verse 5, while he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And suddenly a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." When the disciples heard it, they fell on their faces and were greatly afraid. So St. Peter kind of gets cut off before anybody could answer him, right? Because it says while he was still speaking. Right. So God cuts him off, and they pretty much all fall flat on their faces. Don't have a lot else to say after that. But Jesus came and touched them and said, "Arise and do not be afraid." When they had lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. Now as they came down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them, saying, "Tell the vision to no one until the Son of Man is risen from the dead." So he shows the three of them this vision of what? Of what's going to ultimately come out of the other side of all of the suffering and all of the death and everything they're about to see, that they're about to go through. Right? And if you read the hymns on the Feast of Transfiguration, it talks about that Christ showed that this before the Passion, right, before his suffering, so that when that happened, they would understand and know the purpose of it and where this was going. Now we know it didn't work, right? Because, as we remember, James took off with the other disciples. St. Peter denied him, right? They all pretty much figured, oh, he's dead, it's over, right? So they didn't get the message. But again, Jesus tried, right? And he tells them, don't tell somebody after he's raised from the dead. Well, after he was raised from the dead, all of a sudden it made sense.
Then they got it.
Then they got it, right? He didn't want them going and telling it why. Because what would St. Peter have told people if he went around telling people about this?
They thought it's crazy.
No. What would St. Peter have told people? Did he understand what he just saw? Clearly not. He wanted to build tents and hang out, right? He didn't understand the purpose of what he saw. Right? He didn't get it. Once Christ was raised from the dead, he was showing us that, so that when this, right? Now he can go and tell people about it. Right? Now he can go and tell people about it. Verse 10, his disciples asked him, saying, "Why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" We've talked about this before, that there was this, in tradition, they believed that there was sort of a two-part Messiah, right? Elijah was going to come first, and then the Messiah. Sort of the way that there was Elijah and Elisha in 2 Kings. So, we've seen discussion of this before. The disciples say to him, well, okay, they at least got this much out of it. We're pretty sure Jesus is the Messiah now, right? After seeing this. Okay, we got that part nailed down, right? Jesus is the Messiah. Right? So they say, well, if you're the Messiah, how come the scribes, I mean, they seem to know what they're talking about with the scriptures. How come they say Elijah is going to come first? I mean, we saw Elijah just now, but I mean, I haven't seen him before that. Right? Verse 11, Jesus answered and said to them, "Indeed, Elijah is coming first and will restore all things. But I say to you that Elijah has come already, and they did not know him, but did to him whatever they wished. Likewise, the Son of Man is also about to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he spoke to them of John the Baptist. So they connect those dots. Right? Oh, okay. So St. John the Baptist was, Elijah was to come. You notice there's still no comment from them about Jesus' comment that he's now going to suffer the way St. John the Baptist suffered. Right? So far, every time he's brought that up, somebody has objected. Right? And said, oh, no.
So do they mean that St. John the Baptist he wasn't really Elijah? Did he have
No, he was not like a reincarnation of Elijah. No.
Okay. So what they're saying, he just had a spirit like his, similar?
Yes. That someone was going to... Remember when Elijah went up into heaven? And this is in the last icon on our iconostas, actually. Remember he threw down his mantle
Right.
to Elisha? And remember that was because Elisha had requested a double portion of his power. So that's the idea. The idea is that of Elijah returning was not that he was going to come back down from heaven necessarily, although some of them interpret it that way. Or it's definitely not any kind of reincarnation, because they didn't have that idea in the Jewish world. But that some other person was going to come and take up that mantle again, right, in the future. And so that's what they're saying about St. John, is that he was the one who came and took up that mantle. So verse 14, and when they had come to the multitude, so they come back down. Here's the big mob of people again, right, waiting to see Jesus. A man came to him, kneeling down to him and saying, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic and suffers severely. For he often falls into the fire and often into the water. So I brought him to your disciples, but they could not cure him. Okay? So this would be the other 9, right, disciples who are down here. They've been apparently all this time trying to help this man, and nothing's been happening. Verse 17, then Jesus answered and said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him here to me. And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the child was cured from that very hour. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, Why could we not cast it out? So Jesus said to them, Because of your unbelief. For assuredly I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, Move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. However, this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting. So a couple interesting things here. First, at the end, our tagline, this kind, right, meaning this demon, so does not come out except by prayer and fasting. Which Jesus said after casting it out and not doing any praying or fasting. Did you ever notice that? He just cast it out. They say, why couldn't we? Well, you didn't have faith. If you had faith, you could tell a mountain to go, and it would move. But this guy really comes out through prayer and fast. Right? It almost seems like it like it contradicts itself. Well, we have to take this in the context here of the rest of Matthew. Right? Remember what we were talking about this last chapter? I know it's been a few weeks, so it seems like a long time, but actually just last chapter, just a few paragraphs back, right? Remember St. Peter made his profession of faith, right? And then Jesus said to them, plural, to the disciples, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And at the time, we talked about how our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters have a sort of mistaken interpretation of that. Right? That they believe that that was a power that was given to St. Peter, which St. Peter handed on to his successors, and which his successors could sort of delegate downward, right? Down to bishops and priests, to give them the authority to go and forgive people's sins. Right? Whereas we talked about how, number one, it was in the plural case. He wasn't just talking to St. Peter when he said that. He was talking to all of the disciples. Right? Well, now we have this passage. Right? We have this passage addressing not to whom this has been given, but how it functions. Because it's not just that he didn't just give that power to St. Peter. The question is that a power he gave? Is that how to understand this? Right? Because when we get to the Epistle of James, right, which was likely written slightly before, actually, St. Matthew wrote this gospel, what he says about how sins are forgiven is, confess your sins to one another, speaking to the church, and pray for each other that you may be healed. That's how he says confession and forgiveness works. Right? Is that we have a community, that you plural, that's given the ability to bind and loose. But how does that function? Does that function through some representative of the community saying some word of power and boom, it happens? Right? No. It happens through the community coming together and praying. So how do we deal with healing? Right? How do we deal with healing as a church? We're going to see as we get into the next chapter. The next chapter is going to back me up on this. I'll come back to it. How do we deal with healing as a church? Right? Do we find someone who has the gift of the power of healing? Like Benny Hinn, right? or somebody else to come and bat, right? And that does it? And they just have enough faith? They have a faith that can move mountains, and so boom, it works? Right? Or do we all get together and do we all pray for one another? Matthew here, and James, right, is saying the opposite. Like I said, as we get into the next chapter, I think I'm going to be borne out on this. Right? That the Roman Catholic understanding of this is very keyed into the understanding that the world had at this time. Right? You've got the gods, and they're behind Caesar. Right? They put Caesar in place to rule the world. Right? Because he's one of them. Right? And then Caesar rules the world, and he gives his power to his governors and other officials, right, to wield his power. Right? And they're responsible to him. Right? But it's all delegated down. It's all delegated down. And everybody's goal in life is to try to work their way up the ladder. Get more wealth, more power, right? More prestige. Right? Is that how, as we go forward, the question to keep in mind, is that how Christ is seeing his church is going to be? Where there's going to be a big chair at the top that everybody wants to get. And where everybody's politicking and going to try and get promoted and work their way up. We'll see. So verse 22. Now while they were staying in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is about to be betrayed into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and the third day he will be raised up." And they were exceedingly sorrowful. And I say, why were they sorrowful? He just said he's going to rise from the dead. Well, because they still don't get it. Right? They think what he's saying is, well, we're going to Jerusalem, and you know what happens most of the time when messiahs go to Jerusalem, it doesn't go so well. So they're hearing him and saying, "Oh, we're going to Jerusalem, and I'm probably going to get killed." Right? They're not following, the idea that he's not saying he's going to get killed. He's saying he's going to lay down his life, and then he's going to be raised again. This is why they're still sorrowful. They're not tracking. And before we're too harsh with them, right? I've said this before, but I'll remind us again. That is pretty much what happened to failed messiahs. Yeah. Right? The mark of a failed messiah is you went to Jerusalem and tried to start a revolution, and the Romans executed you. Because this happened several times while the disciples have been alive. They've witnessed it. Right? They've seen the crucifixions. Okay. So the idea that Jesus is saying this is or is probably or is what's going to happen to me too, it's understandable why it's confusing, right? It's like, wait a minute, are you saying you're not sure that you were the Messiah, right? You know, are we betting here? You know, are we putting all our money on black and it could be red? You know, this is. Verse 24, when they had come to Capernaum, those who received the temple tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the temple tax?" We've seen how the Pharisees are always being real helpful, right? They always want to make sure. Now, the temple tax, in terms of what it was, the temple tax was not an official tax. It wasn't levied by the Romans. It was levied by the temple itself. Right? They had to support the temple and keep it running, right, and keep it operating. And part of the problem they had was they couldn't take Roman money. Because Roman money all had what on it?
Caesar.
The image of Caesar on it, right? And usually on the other side, the image of some pagan god or other, right? So they couldn't take that into the temple, right? They couldn't take Roman money. Okay. And this is why we're going to see there are money changers at the at the temple, because at the temple you can only use this temple money. It's like tokens at a video game arcade, right? You can only use this. Your regular money's no good here. You can only use these tokens, right? So obviously, at the same time, they didn't really have the power to enforce it, right? They didn't have the power to enforce it because it wasn't a Roman tax, right? They couldn't send soldiers to come and collect it. This is why they ask, does your teacher not pay the temple tax? They're basically saying, does your teacher not care about the temple? Are you rejecting the temple? Right? They're trying to get him on. And remember, looking ahead, when they bring all the false allegations against Jesus, remember the one that they find that kind of sticks was the whole thing about destroying the temple, rebuilding it in 3 days. So this whole idea that maybe he's anti-temple, they think might be something right, they could get him on. So, again, this is essentially voluntary. And part of what went on with this was there was a big spat when Pontius Pilate first became the governor, which would have been, give or take, about 6 years before where we are right now. When he first became governor, he tried to set up a statue of Caesar in the temple because he didn't know any better. He honestly didn't know any better. And that, of course, caused a big problem from which he was still sort of recovering. And so out of that crisis, he had declared just sort of a total hands-off policy on the temple, which meant even if they asked him, he wouldn't have enforced the temple tax. Right? He said, okay, well, you guys are on your own. We'll have nothing to do with you, but don't ask us for anything. Essentially was what boiled out of that crisis. Okay. So they come to try and get him on this. Does your teacher not pay the temple tax? Verse 25, he said yes. And when he had come into the house, Jesus anticipated him, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take customs or taxes? From their sons or from strangers?" Peter said to him, "From strangers." Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are free. Nevertheless, lest we offend them, go to the sea, cast in a hook, and take the fish that comes up first. When you have opened its mouth, you will find a piece of money. Take that and give it to them for me and you." Okay, so he gives them this neat magic way to get the money. But the more important part is, right, who do people collect taxes from? Right? When Caesar wants taxes, he doesn't go and hit up his kids. Right? In fact, that would be a bad idea if you were a tax collector. Right? To go and bug Caesar's wife and kids and cousins to try and collect the tax money, right? That would not go well, right? No, you go and you hit up the the rabble. Right? That's why the Judean people hated tax collectors so much. Right? Because they were considered sort of being non-citizens. They're Romans didn't care about them. They're basically just there to be milked for money, labor, right? Slave labor, right? That was basically what they were there for. So he says, so Jesus' point is what? We actually don't have to pay shouldn't have to pay the temple tax, right? Because the temple is whose house? It's God's house, right? And Jesus is right? His son, so right? He doesn't have to pay taxes in his own house, right? But notice he's also including Peter. He's also including Peter. So the family of God includes not just him. Oh, he's the Messiah, he's the king, he's important, right? But it includes fisherman St. Peter, illiterate fisherman St. Peter, as well as part of the family of God too. Right? Not just Caesar up here, is one of the gods and all that. So that contrast there is important. Chapter 18, at that time, see, that's an important transition. At that time, just then, right? While Jesus was saying this to Peter, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Right? Somewhat ironically, right? They're in this conversation. Oh, how do you get the big chair? Right? How do you get to be the executive vice president? I know you're the king, but how do we get to be the, vice king? Is there a vice king? And Jesus called a little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, "Assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me." So, we get this tilted on its head. Now, traditionally, I'll just make the comment that this was actually St. Ignatius of Antioch was actually the child who Jesus set there. But he didn't mean to say St. Ignatius is the greatest. That wasn't his point. Although St. Ignatius is great in the kingdom of heaven. And this passage is one of those passages that reading popular interpretation of, you'll pull your hair out. Or at least I do. Because, number one, you get a lot of sappy, I believe the children are the future. Because, we need to become like little children because they're so innocent. And they obviously never met me when I was a little kid. I was not innocent. I was more from the, St. Augustine in the Confessions says that when he was an infant, the only thing that kept him from sinning was the weakness of his limbs. But as soon as he could stand up and run, he was ready to start wreaking havoc, right? That was me as a kid. So, there's this whole, we need to be innocent like children, or children are sweet, or children have some special relationship with God, right? And you get all this kind of sappy stuff that, again, drives me bonkers. You have to go back to society at this time, okay? Right? We're in a society that's gone 180 degrees the other direction, right? You tell a kid no in public. Oh, how dare you say something negative to my child, right? And helicopter parents, and all this kind of stuff. And everyone's child is just this beautiful, wonderful creation, right? And everything, and is so special, and can do anything they want in their life, and they're all going to be president, and they're all going to be doctors and lawyers at the same time, and all this. Children at this time in history were basically a step above like rats and wild dogs and cats, right? Especially peasant children, right? Especially peasant children. If you were wealthy, you'd have one male child who was the heir, who got everything. right? The rest of the kids were spares. In case something happened to the heir, right? Because relatively low life expectancy. Something might happen to him, we might need some backup kids. But otherwise, if things went as planned, the heir inherited everything and all the other kids inherited nothing and they were on their own. Okay? That's how it worked. Okay? And peasant kids didn't even have anything to inherit. Right? Because their parents didn't have anything to pass on to them. Right? So they're just basically running around in the streets like stray dogs and cats. Right? Causing trouble. Okay? Causing trouble. So this is a picture not of some kind of childlike beauty and innocence. Right? This is a picture of sort of, in terms of humanity, right? And they very much thought of humanity this way in this world. They thought of different human beings as having a different value. Right? As having a different value. And peasant kids was pretty much the bottom of the list. Right? In terms of worthwhile human beings. Peasant adult wasn't much higher. Right? But slaves were better than peasant kids. Slaves had some value. Right? You could get some work out of them. Right? Peasants were generally, if they were peasants and they weren't slaves, right? That was basically because the Romans considered, we're not going to be able to get anything useful out of this peasant. Right? Otherwise they would have been enslaved already. Right? So they were a level lower than slaves. Okay? So when Jesus says, if you want to be great in the kingdom of heaven, you have to humble yourself down to the level of this little kid I just grabbed running around in the street. Right? He's saying you got to humble yourself all the way to the bottom. All the way to the bottom of human beings. Right? Not only do you not want to be like Caesar, not only do you not want to be a senator, not only do you not want to be a freeman in Rome with an estate, right? You got to lower yourself down to like these little kids running down the street with nothing, who have nothing. Right? That's the picture he's giving. Right? And then at the end of verse 5, whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. Right? It's not that Jesus just really likes kids. Right? Right? It's because, as we saw all through the Old Testament, right? Who is it who God, when God makes his judgment, he judges them based on how they treat who? Widows, orphans, strangers, right? Aliens, right? All the people who can't stick up for themselves, right? All the people who have no power, the weak, the powerless, right? So when Jesus says that, he's saying, because this is the ultimate example, and this is someone completely weak, powerless, helpless. Right? Roman rides through town and tramples this kid with their horse. Nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to happen. Right? Kid may or may not get buried, depending on if his parents are still alive. Right? So Jesus is saying, right? Number one, you want to be great in the kingdom of heaven, you got to come down here. Right? And number two, you're going to be judged in the kingdom of heaven by how you treat people down here. People like this little child. Verse 6, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. That's pretty graphic. Just in case you don't know what a millstone is. Millstone is a giant round stone with a hole in the middle. Right? They set two of them on top of each other. You put the grain in between and turn it. Right? To grind it. So you can imagine having a big stone like that tied around your neck and then get chucked into... Right? This is not something you want to happen to you. Okay?
General God, he got the idea.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe. The cement shoes. Yeah. So, and again, it's better for you. Be better for you to have that happen to you than to face the judgment you're going to face if you lead a child like this into sin. Right? Now, why does he say lead a child like this into sin? Why doesn't he say if you abuse a child like this, or if you don't help a child like this? Because, remember, the disciples came and asked him what question? They want to be leaders. Right? They want to be leaders. They want these positions of authority, right, in the kingdom. Right? He says, well, judgment on you, if you're a leader, based on where you lead my people, is going to be harder on you than it is on everyone else. Right? St. Paul comes back to this and he says, not many of you should presume to be teachers. Right? Everybody finds that verse when we ask for Sunday school teachers every year. But the point he's making is, you want a position of leadership, with that comes more accountability. Right? More accountability. Because in the church, going up the ladder doesn't get you more power, right? Doesn't give you more rights. Doesn't give you the authority over people to order them about. Right? Doesn't make other people your servants or your slaves. Right? As you move up in the church, what you get is more responsibility and more accountability and a stricter judgment. That's what Jesus is saying to them in response to their question. Saying, you think you want, right? You think you want. Do you really? Do you know what that entails? And this is the teaching of the church. When I stand in front of Christ on the day of judgment, I have to not only answer for all the horrible things I've done, I have to answer for every single one of you. And everything I've said to you, and everything I've said to you in confession, and every sin of yours I've forgiven and overlooked, and every sin of yours I haven't forgiven and overlooked, I'm going to have to give an account for. Okay? And Bishop Thomas is going to have to give an account for himself, and for me and the rest of his clergy, and for all the people in all the churches of his diocese. And Metropolitan Joseph is going to have to give an account for himself, for all the bishops of the synod, for all the priests of this archdiocese, and all the deacons, and all the churches. Who here wants to be metropolitan now? Or a bishop, right? This is why you never trust someone who wants to be a bishop. Because something is wrong with them. They don't get it. If they got it, they would do what St. John Chrysostom did and run and hide in a cave for 2 years so they couldn't make them a bishop. Right? Because that's the reality of what it entails. Okay? And that's what Christ is starting to try to get through to them. Verse 7, woe to the world because of offenses. For offenses must come, but woe to that man by whom the offense comes. If your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life lame or maimed, rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into the everlasting fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life with 1 eye, rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into hellfire. Now, this is not to be taken literally. I probably don't have a lot of danger here. There have been people in history who have taken this literally.
So just recently.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is not literally your eye. Don't need anybody gouging out any eyes or cutting off their hands or feet. Okay? But the point is, right, none of these things is as valuable as eternal life. Right? So let me rephrase it a little. Right? it would be better to enter into life unemployed than go to hell as a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Right? If what you have to do to become the CEO of a Fortune 500 company and stay there is participate in wickedness. Right? Better to be broke. Right? Better to be broke and rich to do evil. Right? It's better to have nothing. So this is what he's getting at. He's getting at not us physically chopping ourselves up and mutilating ourselves. He's getting at us taking stock of our life and saying, what are these things? Right? The word for offense that's translated offenses here is literally stumbling blocks. Right? Things you trip over. Right? What are the things in your life that you keep tripping over? Right? No matter how valuable you may think they are, better to get rid of them and receive eternal life, right, than to keep them, right, and end up falling and not getting up. That's what he's getting at. Verse 10, take heed that you do not despise one of these little ones. And he's still talking about this child. Despise one of these little ones. What does he mean? Well, again, these are the bottom of the pool, right? These kids will, right? Like the stray dog or cat. Get us out of here. Right? Not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. This is a reference to guardian angels, right? But to take this in context, where have we heard of this idea of somebody having an angel? Remember back in Daniel, when Gabriel came to talk to Daniel. He said he was delayed because he got in a fight with the Prince of Persia. Right? We talked about at that time, going all the way back to Deuteronomy, this tradition that sort of the nations of the world had sort of guardian angels, with St. Michael was sort of Israel's guardian angel. These other angels had fallen and become demons and were worshipped by the other nations. Okay? So, the idea they have in their head, right? Both are pagan. Yes, Caesar has, Zeus, the demon Satan, behind him, right? Who's working for him. They're a Jewish audience, right? And they would say, well, yeah, the angels of God are protecting Israel and protecting the holy man and the Messiah, right? Jesus is saying, yeah, guess what? Not just them. This little kid, who you think is completely unimportant, right, living in the streets, he's got an angel too. He stands in front of my Father in heaven, and who's going to ask for an account for how he's treated and what you do to him. Verse 12, what do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, does he not leave the 99 and go to the mountains to seek the one that is straying? And if he should find it, assuredly I say to you, he rejoices more over that sheep than over the 99 that did not go astray. Even so, it is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. Now this little parable about the sheep is in a very different place here in St. Matthew's Gospel than it is in the other Gospels. Right? In Luke especially, in St. Luke's Gospel, this is part of a set of parables. Right? You have the lost sheep, and then you have the lost coin, and then you have the prodigal son. Here it's in a different place. It's not so much about the lost part as it is about the counting part. Right? Because if you're a shepherd and you're keeping track of the sheep, one of the very important things you do is count them. Some of you probably already know I worked in a jail for a while. Right? When you work in a prison, right, 6 times a day you have count. Right? You have count, where everybody stops moving, and you count up everybody, and you make sure everybody's there. That's pretty much an important part of the job. Same thing with a shepherd. You're out there overseeing 100 sheep. Every so often, you got to count, make sure they're all there. If there's one missing, right? You got 99 still there, there's one missing. No shepherd is going to say, well, I got most of them. 99% is pretty darn good. Right? It's still an A. Right? Right? Just like in the jail, if we were just short by one, we didn't just go, well, I'm sure he's fine. Right? Right? You don't just ignore it, right? He goes out, he leaves the 99, he goes out and he finds that one. He goes out and he finds that one. And Jesus is trying to say that we in the kingdom need to be that way about people. That we don't look out at the church on Sunday and say, well, most everybody's here. We got a good 99%. Right? Well, so, they don't pledge much. Right? You know, we laugh, but there's...
It's not funny.
How often do we... They're always up to no good. They're probably out drinking. Right? Jesus is saying we need to be careful about who we decide doesn't count. Who we decide isn't important. Right? Who's irrelevant. Because that person who we aren't worried about because we got 99% is just as important to God as ourselves and everyone else in that 99%. And in fact, verse 14, it is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish.
Would you not also be able to apply that to the issues that we see in modern day, the abortion issue?
Oh yeah.
Here you've got the innocence of that child, not a fetus, a child, which then is being aborted.
Right.
How do you live with that?
We have a lot of people in our society. The unborn we don't count as people. In fact, I was utterly flummoxed that the head of Planned Parenthood said the other day that legal abortion is important for reducing infant mortality. Which was essentially the argument we have to be able to abort children because they might die otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, logic. But yeah, the unborn don't count. The extremely elderly and sick don't count anymore.
Yeah.
They become a burden
Yeah.
at some point. The extremely poor, we consider them a burden. Oh, they're just leeching off the system. They're not important. Right? All down the list. Right, all down the list. And this applies to all of that. Christ is telling us there is no human being who doesn't count. Right? Who doesn't count and who isn't important to God and for whom God isn't going to ultimately require an answer for what happened to them. And that includes in this country, in every country in the world. In every country in the world. And so, yeah, that is something that should unsettle us. That should unsettle us. And we need to work on our counting. Right? And consider, God, he's telling us that since every human being is precious to God, every human being needs to be that precious to us. You know, the same way the sheep is precious to the shepherd. Parable of the lost coin. You know, the woman loses one of her coins. She doesn't just say, oh, well, I got most of my money. Right? She goes and tears the house apart trying to find it. You know, we far from tear the house apart trying to find people who are, missing. We're lucky if we go to any effort at all. Okay, so, verse 15. Now, verse 15 starts with moreover. I'm kind of hammering on these transitions because part of the problem with a lot of these passages is they get kind of pulled out, right, of context. And if you pull things out of context, you can do sort of whatever you want with them, right? You can read all kinds of things into them. But Jesus here is speaking in a very orderly way, right? He's talking about one main theme, and these things are connected, right? Things are connected. Verse 15, moreover, if your brother sins against you, so he's just talked to us about how precious each person should be. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you have gained your brother. What does that mean, you've gained your brother? One sheep that was potentially out there wandering around, you've gotten back. Right? Now notice, we're going to have a couple of steps here. This is step one. If your brother sins against you, go and speak to him, just you and him alone. Notice what it does not say. When your brother sins against you, go and tell your family and your cousins how horrible your brother is and the mean thing he did to you. Right? Go tell all your coworkers that your brother's a bum right? And he did these horrible things to you. That is the exact opposite of what he says. Right? He says you go and talk to him, you and him alone. Right? Just the two of you. Okay? And hopefully you can work things out. If you have worked things out, then great. No problem. Right? He's back in the flock. There's no further issues from there. Okay? Verse 6. Yes.
What if they don't want to work it?
Well, that's step 2. Here's we're getting there. There's steps here. Verse 16. But if he will not hear, take with you 1 or 2 more, that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. Okay. So again, if he won't listen to you, it doesn't say, go and tell everyone you can find who will listen how he did horrible things to you and you tried to work it out, but he wouldn't have any of it. Right? Now forgiving you are, but they're just above. No. You go and you find 2 or 3 people who you trust, and the 2 or 3 sit down with them. Right? That way you have witnesses, right, to what you spoke about. And those witnesses aren't necessarily going to say that you're totally in the right and the other person is totally in the wrong. Right? But you have 2 other people there who can try and resolve the issue. But let's say that doesn't work. Right? Verse 17. If he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church. Now the word that's translated church here is the word assembly. Right? That we use for church. In the Old Testament, that word referred to, the people. Right? The people of the synagogue or the people of the faith. Of course, in our context, it would be the church or the parish, right? But if he refuses to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector. Okay? Now, let me continue a little bit. Verse 18, assuredly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. I told you this chapter was going to back me up. Okay? So, what is... When Jesus says to the apostles, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Right? He didn't tell them right at that moment how practically that all was going to unfold. So you might come, from a Roman Catholic point of view, and say, okay, well, he's giving them individually the power and authority to forgive people's sins. Except, next chapter, right? Here we have Jesus laying out how it works. Right? When he said you plural, right? You plural was the assembly. Okay? And so this is how Jesus set forth that sins would be dealt with in the church. Okay? Sins would be dealt with in the church. And we're going to see not only in St. James, but that this was treated very strictly in the early church. St. Paul has some pretty harsh words for for Christians who take other Christians to court, for example, to try to resolve differences. Right? So this is what the early church did. This is what Christ told the early church to do, and therefore, yes, this is what we should do.
So when you said if they refuse, do they excommunicate them from church?
If they refuse to listen to the whole church,
Yeah, because it says they'll be like heathens
Yes.
and taxes.
yes,
So they're out.
that's what binding something in heaven means. That's what binding something in heaven means. It means, she was asking if it says if they refuse, with the whole church says to them, does that mean they're excommunicated, they're cut off? And that's exactly what it means. St. Paul in 1 Corinthians, there's an issue when we get to 1 Corinthians. You think we have issues in our church. In Corinth, there was a guy who was sleeping with his own mother. And St. Paul had to address this because unfortunately the community wasn't. Okay? And he basically tells them to go through this process, and they had mostly gone through it, and he wasn't listening. And so he describes excommunicating him as handing him over to Satan. That's the terminology he uses. Right? Why? Well, because the picture is, remember the picture we had back when Israel was traveling through the wilderness? There was the camp, and there was the wilderness outside the camp. The wilderness outside the camp is where the devil was, and where, right, it was unclean, right? That's the picture. You're exiling them. You're throwing them out of the camp. Now, St. Paul goes further, that the purpose of that is not to get rid of them permanently. The purpose of that is that once they experience what it's like to be cut off from Christ and His grace, they'll come back, right? They'll realize what they've lost, right? Same way Adam and Eve, after they got thrown out of the garden, realized what they lost, right? And then were ready to repent. Or Israel when they were sent into exile, right? It's that same pattern. We send somebody into exile like that is the ultimate thing when we've tried everything else, hoping that at least will get through to them and get them to repent and come back. The purpose is always to get them back. Right? Yes, it's important that we that we take this seriously, because this is when we get into St. Paul again, he's going to give these lists of sins, and he's going to talk about fornicators and drunkards and murderers and thieves and gossips. And we're going to go, One of these things seems not like the other. Right? Like, gossiping, that's not that bad. Oh, it's not as bad. Right? This is why it's as bad. Thank you. This is why it's bad, right? Because the whole purpose of the church, the whole purpose of this community that Christ started is to reconcile people to God. That's the whole purpose. And gossip and slander does what? Does the opposite. It breaks the community apart, breaks people apart from each other, pulls them away from God. So it's just as serious or more serious in eternal terms, right? In eternal consequences. It's just as serious or more serious than murder or theft or drunkenness or fornication. And it's not something to be taken lightly, even though we like to do it, because we kind of all like to participate in gossip once in a while a little bit, right? But it's not something to be taken lightly. Verse 19, again I say to you that if two of you agree on earth concerning anything that they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst of them. And this is, of course, what we confess every liturgy when we're all gathered together. Christ is in our midst. And he is and ever shall be. Because we're gathered to worship. Right? So, going back to our example of the exorcism, who had the power to cast the demon out of the boy? Christ, right? And only Christ, right? The disciples didn't have the power to do it. If the disciples were going to do it, how were they going to do it? Prayer and fasting. Prayer to who? Christ, right? Right? Prayer and fasting. Christ has that power, ultimately. Right? Which is why at the end of confession, right, in the Orthodox Church, unlike the Roman Catholic Church where they say ego te absolvo, right, I forgive you of your sins, right? The Orthodox Church, I start out the prayer by saying, I have no power on earth to forgive sins, but God alone. Right? But based on what Christ said to his apostles, that whatever we bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever we loose on earth will be loose in heaven, I can say, right, that those sins you have confessed have been forgiven you. Right? I'm not speaking on behalf of some power vested in me by God. I'm speaking on behalf of the church. I'm speaking on behalf of the community when I say that at the end of confession. So it's a very different view. It's a very different view between the Orthodox Church and Roman Catholicism, and I think the Orthodox view is coming right out of these passages. Verse 21, then Peter came to him and said, okay, here's Peter again.
He's the only one who
Right?
speaks up.
When the end of the lecture comes, and Jesus, any questions, and everybody's getting ready to leave, right? Say Peter's the one with his hand up. Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? Right? So he's looking at this, okay, you gave me this process. How many times do I have to do this with the same guy? Right? Like, I mean, after 7 times, right? 7 perfect number, right? After 7 times, right, I can just write this guy off, right? I can just tell him to go pound sand, right? I'm done with him, right? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. And this doesn't mean 490 either. For those of you wanting to be literal, yeah. I have forgiven my wife 283 times. She has 207 left. That's not the point, right? Verse 23, therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And when he had begun to settle accounts, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. Okay? A talent was about 40 pounds of silver.
What?
So, this guy's not paying it back. Right? This is like my student loans. This is never happening. Right? This is just a theoretical number on paper. Okay? But as he was not able to pay, his master commanded that he be sold and his wife and children and all that he had, and that payment be made. Right? Because this is how things worked in the ancient world. You had a debt you couldn't pay. Guess what? You're a slave now. Right? And if it's a debt this big, I don't know how he would get a debt that big, but must have gone to Harvard. That it's you, your wife, your kids, right? Now you're going to spend the rest of your lives as slaves. Verse 26, the servant therefore fell down before him, saying, Master, have patience with me, and I will pay you all. Okay. So there's already a disconnect there. Right? Just give me a couple weeks. Right? and I'll have it. Sure. And the master of that servant was moved with compassion, released him, and forgave him the debt. That's a lot of compassion. Okay. He looked at this guy, he said, clearly this guy does not get it. Right? But I'm going to let it go for the sake of his family, right? Verse 28, but that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. Okay? So that's probably equivalent of about $100. Right? And he laid hands on him and took him by the throat. Right? So he starts strangling the guy. He says, pay me what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down at his feet and begged him, saying, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you all." Right? He says the same thing, right? Except he realistically probably could eventually pay him the 100 denarii. Verse 30, and he would not, but went and threw him into prison till he should pay the debt. So when his fellow servants saw...
Where's the logic in that? Where does the logic in that?
Well, then as now, there was technically a prison wage. And like now, it was a tiny, tiny amount. Where theoretically... But yeah, this is basically the idea is he's just showing it's pure spite. Pure spite to this other guy who owes him this money. Because he could have worked it off much faster if he hadn't thrown him in prison. And so his fellow servants saw what he had done. They were very grieved and came and told the master of all what had been done. Then his master, after he had called him, said to him, "You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. Should you not also have had compassion on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you?" And his master was angry and delivered him to the torturers until he should pay all that was due to him. He's handing him over to torturers. He's not making any money. Right? Meaning, he's never paying off anybody anything. Right? Verse 35, so my heavenly Father also will do to you if each of you from his heart does not forgive his brother his trespasses. The point here being, if we have any kind of awareness of what God has forgiven us, and a lot of times, frankly, we don't.
Amen.
I don't most of the time. Right? If we're really aware of how much God has forgiven us, how much He's let slide with us, right? How much better we've gotten in our lives than what we deserve, then it's going to be impossible for us to not be forgiving to other people. Right? Because this servant, the fact that he couldn't forgive this other person, the fact that this debt this other person had to her seemed so terrible, right? Was why? It was because he had no clue. Right? He had no understanding of what he himself had done and what he himself had been forgiven. Right? There's no clue. There's no clue. Right? And so he's not going to be patient with this other person because he doesn't realize how patient God has been with him. Right? So he thinks, this is, I'm not cradle Orthodox, but I was cradle Christian, and so you look back and you think, I haven't done anything really terrible. Right? I never killed anybody. Right? I never actually committed actual adultery. I never stole anything more expensive than maybe a candy bar or two. Nothing real bad. Right? You go back and you think, I'm a pretty good guy. And I'm a pretty good guy. Right? And someone comes and does something mean to me, for no reason. Where does he get off? Right? Right? And so how many times do I have to forgive this clown? 7 times he does stuff to me? 490 times? Right? Jesus say, Peter, do you have any idea how many times God has forgiven you? You want him to just do 7? You want him to just do 490? And then that's it? That's your quota? Right? So that's where he's pushing here, and we're gonna have to stop here because of time. But when we get into, it's going to be important to remember this when we get into chapter 19 here, because Jesus is going to talk about divorce. And this passage, again, is one that's very controversial and gets pulled out of context a lot. But it's in the context of this. It's in the context of him talking about forgiveness. And the forgiveness of God and the patience of God with our sins. And how we need to have patience with others when they sin against us in ways that are relatively minor, if we're honest about a lot of the things that we've done in our lives. Okay? So that's where we'll end for tonight. And we'll pick up, not next week, because Father Matthew is doing Vespers over at St. John's, the other side of the river. So he's doing Vespers that next Sunday night. So the week after the 10th, April 10th, 2 weeks from tonight, we'll pick up here in chapter 19.
So we're invited over.
So yes, everybody's invited over there. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.